Спасибо, так лучше.
Меня просили, чтобы те, кто не понимают по-русски, чтобы я, в общем, говорил по-английски. Так что I'm going to switch into English as of now, and it'll be a little bit of a linguistical salad because most of the terms are obviously in Church Slavonic or Russian, but most of the discussion that I'll have will be in English, so bear with me on that. So this is the second in the series of workshops. The first one, those of you who were able to attend, was Basic Music Grammar and Theory. This is on the structure of common services and for choir members, the way that our church books are laid out. So, as a preference, as a prelude to this, the structure of the services can also be called Bogoslovny Ustav. Okay? And basically what that is an itemized list of those things that are part of our church services. They are called tipikon, and Slavyansky tipikon, the one that we use today, was adapted from the tipikon of Jerusalem towards the end of the 17th century. And it was adopted by the Russian Orthodox Church. The tipikon literally is following in order. So you have a list of things like a recipe. You have a list of things that comprise your recipe. The church service has a tipikon, which is like a recipe of what goes into the service. And it sounds like it's a very rigid and universal thing, where in practice it isn't. Tipikon is adapted by monasteries, by cathedrals, and by parishes. And the adaptation really takes into account the specific requirements and circumstances. Okay? So when somebody says tipikon, it shouldn't mean to you that it's an absolute list of everything that happens every place the same way. Tipikon is a framework which is adapted. The ultimate authority for how church services are conducted at the parish level is the parish priest. He is the one that decides how the tipikon is implemented. And obviously the choir and the deacon and everybody else that's participating in the service is obliged to follow the pastor's direction. The pastor's direction are obviously subject to hierarchical approval. So the point here is when you hear ustav or tipikon, it's not one thing. It's an outline that's implemented in different ways in different places. Generally, I'm going to use the word generally an awful lot today because the church service structure, although it may seem to be, we're Orthodox and we haven't changed anything since the first century and so forth, that's all true. But the actual implementation is actually quite different and quite dynamic. So I'm going to use words like generally an awful lot. Generally, ustav in monasteries is more complete in its implementation. In other words, everything that's supposed to be read, everything that's supposed to be sung, more than likely is included in the services. Very little is omitted. Many or all of the prayers are chanted. And there's a significance to that I'll go over later. And in many times what you'll see is if you open up a book for a service, you'll see that some stihira or some prabha or something has to be read more than once. Generally, in monasteries, when that happens, they actually read it the indicated number of times, 2 and 3 sometimes. At cathedrals generally have more complete implementation of the ustav than parish churches. And part of the reason for that is because you have generally bishops there, you have some sort of brotherhood of monks. So generally cathedrals reflect closer to monastic style of services than parish churches. So I wanted to give you that background because now everything else that I'm going to be talking about in the structure of services is pertaining to our parish. Okay? So there are some guiding principles of the services that we have that Stefan and I and Marina went over when we got here. And the guiding principles were this, that all of the elements of a service be retained in the service. Okay? Include all those elements that are significant to the commemoration. Now, one will think, you know, it's a service. The reality is that every day there are multiple saints, multiple icons, multiple liturgical events, праздники, that are spread all throughout the year. And so, every time that we come Saturday night or during the week, in practice, we are serving Sierra, but its components vary depending on whether there's a saint that's being commemorated, or an event, or some major holiday. So the guiding principle in our services is that elements that are significant to the commemoration be included in the service. So for example, tomorrow night, there'll be a service for St. Vladimir. It would make no sense at all to have the Sienna be devoid of his trapaj, of stichiri about him, and canon about him. It would make no sense. Why serve the service? Okay? So the important thing is to keep the elements that are significant to the commemoration. And this could be saints, so stichiri, canoni, trapari, kandaki, prakimni, stichi. Those are the things that are written specifically for events or groups of events, and those are the things that we need to retain in our service. We have what I call a rational balance between reading and chanting, and I'll go over this in a minute. And the abbreviations that we do, that every parish does, that every cathedral does, things that we abbreviate from the normal 100% implementation of Typikon, they need to be such that the structure and the sense of the service remain intact. Okay. And of course, all of these guidelines come from the pastor, and the altar services and choir members are, of course, required to implement those. So this little chart talks, really is out of a communication course. And so the x-axis, if you will, is one person speaking on one tone, like I am right now. The next, and this is just categories, the next is one person singing or chanting. This is multiple people reading at the same time. This is multiple people chanting. And this is many people singing something elaborate and polyphonic. Okay? And on this side is oral communication clarity. Okay? So treat it as an XY type graph. And the point of this is that one person speaking on one tone is the most clear communication that you can have. I think everybody that understands English can understand what I'm saying now. If I started singing this, the singing would get in the way of the words a little bit. And if I asked 4 or 5 people to come up and read with me, the chance that we would read exactly the same way and inflect the words the same way are fairly low. So the clarity of oral communication is greatest here and least here. Okay? At the same time, there are things that we become familiar with in church services. I don't think there's a person in this room that doesn't know Otche Nach. That's a very familiar thing. Воскресные тропари, кандаки, the beginnings of Господи возвах, Сятое Дыхание. Those are the kinds of things that you hear every week. The words are the same. The tune changes, but the words are the same. So, in terms of familiarity, those things that are repeated often, obviously, are the most familiar. The things that are least familiar are the special stihiri, the special kanoni, that are read maybe once a year. For example, what we'll be reading tomorrow night for Veliki Apostolnik Knyaz Vladimir. We read those once a year. So nobody knows those. And what the rational basis of our church service is today is that those things that are the most familiar, we tend to sing. Because since people know them already, the communication clarity, although it's low, will still get the message across to us and our parishioners. On the other hand, those things that are uncommon, those we generally read because the communication clarity is the biggest. So as an example, let's take a stihira that we sing once a year. And we get together and we sing it, let's say, on Четвертый глас. I don't know it very well. The singers, the choir doesn't know it very well. So we'll stumble through it and we'll sing it, but it won't be as clear as if Marina reads it. In other words, if you're listening, you'll understand what the stihira is about far easier if it's read. And so that's the way that we construct the way that we do Господи возвах. That's the way that we do Nachvalitie and other cases that I'll go through. But I wanted to get this concept across, that the clearest form of communication is spoken by one person. The least clear is when many, many people are singing, especially something that's elaborate. So, as I said, the balance of what I'm going to be talking about is our, and I underline, current implementation of Gustav for our parish. That implementation may or may not be the same that's used in cathedrals and other parishioners, and other parishes, and that's okay. It may or may not be the same as what was used in this parish 40 years ago, and that's okay. It may or may not change sometime in the future. And that's also okay, provided that it be according to Ashtya Nastoятель Izvolit. Because ultimately, it's his responsibility to make sure that the clarity and the sense of the church services that he officiates makes sense to the parishioners. So, diving into what I'm calling common services. Вечерня, vigil, Vespers, утренняя, and первый час, matins, first hour. Then proskonidia, that we don't often really talk about. Третий час, шестой час, third and 6 hours, and the liturgia. And for your comfort and convenience, I've color-coded these according to the book colors that we use upstairs. So, вечерня. Вечерня is, it really has two main elements as far, let me also preface. I have spent exactly 0 hours in seminary, okay? So when it comes to things devotional and spiritual, I'm going to maybe touch on a few things, but I'm by no means an expert. I'm not qualified to talk about it. So I'm going to limit that part of the discussion as much as possible. By way of commercial, next season, our series will include a lecture by Ted Stefan, maybe more than one, on exactly that, what the devotional, spiritual, and symbolic aspects of the services are. So I'm going to steer clear of that because I'm not competent to discuss it. But in general, Вечерня has two functions, my interpretation. One, it includes an awful lot of material about the specific commemoration that's going on, a saint, some event, or something like that. That's the first. And the second is it is a reflection of the Old Testament. It spans from the creation of the world through just not reaching the birth of Christ. And as you'll see, there are a number of things that are sung and read that specifically point to that. Utrenya, on the other hand, goes from the birth of Christ through his resurrection. Okay? And it also, just like Вечерня, includes many, many of the elements that are commemoration specific. So if you say to me, could you give me Вечерня? I will say, no, I can't, unless you tell me for what saint, in what day. There's just no such thing as a generic Вечерня. Same thing with Утренняя. Proskomidия is the service that most of you see Отец Stefan serving in the altar when you're arriving to liturgy. And Proskomidия really has two elements to it. In ancient times, when people got together for services, they actually brought things like bread and wine. Okay? They brought it, they offered it as a gift, they brought it to the priest. And then the service went on to go to the Eucharist. Nowadays, Proskomidия is the first part of liturgy at which the offering of bread